I arrived in the town at the tail end of autumn, when the forest had started to rot in earnest, and the air carried that heavy, sweet smell of wet leaves and iron-rich soil. The road wound through miles of dense woodland, tall pines pressing in close enough that the sky narrowed into a gray ribbon overhead, and by the time the town finally appeared it felt less like I'd reached a destination and more like I'd been permitted entry. There was no sign welcoming anyone in, no painted board or cheerful slogan, just a sudden thinning of trees and a handful of low buildings hunched together as if for warmth. Smoke rose lazily from chimneys, straight up into the still air, and the silence was deep enough that I could hear my own tires crackling over gravel long before I saw another person. It struck me immediately that this wasn't a place people passed through. You either lived here, or you didn't come at all. The ranger station sat on the edge of town, a squat timber building with peeling green paint and a porch that sagged slightly in the middle. Someone had left a light on inside, and when I parked and stepped out of the truck, the quiet wrapped around me so completely it felt physical, like a pressure against my ears. The forest loomed just beyond the tree line behind the station, dark even in daylight, the trunks packed close together and disappearing into shadow after only a few meters. I remember thinking, not for the first time on that drive, that the woods here didn't feel like scenery. They felt occupied. When I went inside, the man who introduced himself as the outgoing ranger shook my hand too firmly and didn't quite meet my eyes. He ran through the handover quickly, keys clinking on the desk, paperwork stacked neatly as if he'd been counting the days until he could leave. He told me about trail maintenance, about seasonal hunting boundaries, about the usual things people expected a ranger to care about, but there were gaps in what he said. Pauses where his voice dropped or shifted direction abruptly, like someone stepping around an obstacle in the dark. When I asked about the mine, because the mine was on every map, clearly marked, a black square just beyond the northern tree line, he paused long enough that the silence felt intentional, before telling me it was sealed, unstable, and none of my concern. I saw it for the first time that evening, while unloading the last of my things. The light was fading quickly, the forest swallowing color as dusk settled in, and from the back of the station, I could just make out the dark cut in the hillside where the mine entrance yawned open. Not open in the literal sense. The shaft had been boarded and reinforced decades ago, according to the records. But present, unmistakable, a wound in the land that refused to close. The ground around it dipped subtly, trees growing at odd angles as if pulled toward it, and the air there seemed heavier, carrying a faint metallic temps that caught in the back of my throat. I stood watching it longer than I meant to, a vague unease creeping in that had nothing to do with safety protocols or structural integrity. When I finally went back inside and locked the door behind me, I did it without thinking, the habit old and automatic. But the sound of the bolt sliding home echoed louder than it should have in the quiet. The town revealed itself slowly over the next few days. There was a general store that doubled as a post office, a diner that served strong coffee and little else, and a handful of houses scattered unevenly between the trees. People were polite, in the distant, careful way of those used to outsiders coming and going, and they asked the expected questions. How long I'd planned to stay, where I'd come from, whether I was used to working alone, but none of them volunteered much about themselves. Conversations slid away from personal details quickly, rerouted into weather or maintenance issues, or the state of the road in winter. I noticed early on that no one mentioned the forest unless I did first, and even then the discussion stayed practical, stripped of anything that might suggest affection or reverence. The woods weren't loved here. They were tolerated, endured. When I asked about the mine again, casually this time, over coffee at the diner, the woman behind the counter stiffened, just enough that I almost missed it, her hand pausing, mid-pour, before she set the pot down with a little more force than necessary. That thing's been dead for years, she said, not looking at me. Best to leave it that way. The first missing person notice I saw was pinned to a corkboard near the entrance of the general store. It was old enough that the edges had curled, the paper yellowed slightly. But the photograph was recent. A man in his late 30s, broad-shouldered, unsmiling, the kind of face you expect to see on someone who's lived hard, but steady. The date at the bottom stopped me short. 3 weeks prior, I asked the man at the counter about it, keeping my tone neutral, and he shrugged in a way that felt rehearsed. Folks go missing sometimes, he said. Hunting accidents, weather, you know how it is. But there was no follow-up, no concern, no suggestion that anyone was looking. Later, When I checked the incident logs at the station, I found the report filed, brief and clinical, marked as resolved without explanation. It didn't sit right with me. In most places I'd worked, a disappearance would have stirred the entire community into motion. Here, it barely registered. The nights were the worst. Once the sun went down, the town folded inward, lights extinguishing early until only the diner's windows glowed faintly against the dark. The forest pressed closer then, the absence of ambient noise making every small sound feel magnified. I lay awake more than once listening to the wind move through the trees, the long, low sigh of it sounding almost like breath. And on 2 separate occasions I thought I heard something else beneath it, a distant scrape, like stone dragged slowly over stone, followed by a pause so complete it left my ears ringing. I told myself it was the old mine settling, timbers shifting deep underground. But the rational explanation didn't soothe the unease. The sound felt deliberate, measured, as if whatever caused it was moving carefully, aware of the space it occupied. When I mentioned it to one of the locals the next day, a man splitting firewood behind his house, he didn't ask for clarification or laugh it off. He just stopped what he was doing and told me, quietly, not to wander near the mine after dark. It was only toward the end of the week that I began to understand the shape of the town's silence. I noticed it in the way conversations stalled when certain topics edged too close to whatever lay beneath the surface. In the way people avoided looking north when the wind shifted and carried that faint metallic smell through the streets. There was grief here, real and heavy, but it had settled into something like acceptance. A collective agreement not to tear open old wounds when they couldn't be healed anyway. I saw it most clearly at a small gathering outside the diner one evening, where a woman stood quietly crying into her husband's shoulder, while the others hovered nearby, offering food, touch, murmured words of comfort. No one asked what had happened. No one needed to. The loss was fresh. I could see it in the way her hands shook. But it wasn't new. It was part of a pattern they all recognized, even if they refused to articulate it. By the time I returned to the station that night, the forest had swallowed the road completely. The darkness so deep, it felt like driving into water. I parked, cut the engine, and sat there for a long moment with my hands on the wheel, listening. Somewhere far off, beyond the trees, there was a sound I couldn't place. Not quite a scream, not quite an animal call, but something in between, stretched thin by distance and shadow. It rose once, faltered, and fell away into silence. I waited for a reaction from the town, for lights to flick on, or doors to open, but nothing happened. The sound might never have existed at all for anyone else. As I finally got out of the truck and headed inside, the mine loomed unseen beyond the tree line. A presence I could feel without looking at, and for the first time since my arrival, I had the distinct, unsettling sense that my being here wasn't just noticed. It was significant. The town had been living with something for a long time, and whether I liked it or not, I had just stepped into the middle of it. The first thing I learned was that no one here would ever tell me the rules outright. They weren't written down anywhere, not on notice boards or in the thin binder of local guidance left behind at the station. And they weren't passed on the way policies usually are, through briefings or warnings delivered with authority. Instead, they existed in the way people paused before answering certain questions, in the way eyes flicked briefly north before returning to whatever task was at hand, in the subtle adjustments of behavior that had nothing to do with courtesy and everything to do with survival. It was like stepping into a current you couldn't see, but immediately felt pulling at you, gently at first, then with increasing insistence, guiding you away from places and thoughts the town had already decided were dangerous. I noticed it most clearly during my morning patrols. The trails closest to town were well maintained, clear of fallen branches and debris. The ground tamped down by years of use, but the further north I went, the more neglected everything became. Signage grew sparse, paint faded, and paths narrowed until they felt more like suggestions than routes. According to the maps, several of these trails should have looped back toward the old mining road, but in practice, they simply dissolved into undergrowth long before reaching it. When I asked one of the maintenance volunteers about the discrepancy, he shrugged and said the forest moved sometimes, which I took at first as a joke until I realized he wasn't smiling. He told me there was no reason for anyone to be out that way anymore, that the land past a certain point didn't belong to recreation or work, and that if I was smart, I'd learn where the walking stopped on its own. The mine itself loomed quietly over everything, an unspoken reference point that shaped the town's geography as much as the roads and buildings did. People gave directions relative to it without ever naming it, gestures, vague but precise, fingers hooking in the air to indicate a general slope or tree line. "Don't take that way after dark," someone would say. Or "that road gets bad in winter," and the implication always hovered just beneath the words. I made a point of walking the perimeter during daylight, staying well back from the entrance, while still getting a sense of the ground around it. The soil there was darker, richer somehow, and the vegetation grew in twisted, uneven patterns, roots exposed as if the earth itself were restless. There were no fresh footprints that I could see, human or otherwise, but there was a sense of disturbance that never quite faded, like the ground had been walked on recently and hadn't settled yet. The first direct warning came from the diner owner, a woman named Ruth who'd lived in the town longer than most and carried herself with the weary authority of someone who'd seen enough to stop asking questions. I'd gone in early one morning before the sun had fully cleared the treetops, the window still fogged from the heat inside, and ordered coffee while she wiped down the counter in slow, methodical circles. We talked about mundane things at first, the weather, the road conditions, how quiet the season had been, and then, without quite meaning to, I mentioned that I planned to check the old northern trails more thoroughly, maybe even assess the mine site for safety compliance. The cloth froze in her hand. She didn't look at me right away, just set it down carefully, as if the movement required deliberation. When she finally met my eyes, there was no anger there, no panic, just a tired firmness that made my stomach tighten. She told me, calmly, that there were places you didn't go here, not because you weren't allowed, but because nothing good came of it, and that if I valued staying on friendly terms with the town, it would be wise to learn the difference. The first direct warning came from the diner owner, a woman named Ruth who'd lived in the town longer than most and carried herself with the weary authority of someone who'd seen enough to stop asking questions. I'd gone in early one morning before the sun had fully cleared the treetops, the window still fogged from the heat inside, and ordered coffee while she wiped down the counter in slow, methodical circles. We talked about mundane things at first, the weather, the road conditions, how quiet the season had been, and then, without quite meaning to, I mentioned that I planned to check the old northern trails more thoroughly, maybe even assess the mine site for safety compliance. The cloth froze in her hand. She didn't look at me right away, just set it down carefully, as if the movement required deliberation. When she finally met my eyes, there was no anger there, no panic, just a tired firmness that made my stomach tighten. She told me, calmly, that there were places you didn't go here, not because you weren't allowed, but because nothing good came of it, and that if I valued staying on friendly terms with the town, it would be wise to learn the difference. After that, the warnings became more frequent, though never more specific. A man at the general store advised me to finish my patrols early once the rain started coming in earnest, saying the ground got unpredictable at night. Another told me it wasn't worth tracking wildlife movement near the old shafts because animals avoided the area for reasons best left unexamined. Each comment, taken on its own, could have been dismissed as superstition or overcautiousness. But together, they formed a loose perimeter around a truth no one wanted to articulate. The town wasn't ignorant of what lived beneath it. It was actively avoiding the shape of the knowledge, keeping it diffuse enough that it couldn't settle into something actionable. The second disappearance happened sooner than I expected. There was no announcement, no gathering this time, just a subtle shift in the town's mood that I felt more than observed. The missing person notice went up quietly, replacing the old one on the corkboard. The paper crisp and new, the photograph of a woman I recognized from the diner, her smile cautious but genuine. The date at the bottom made my chest tighten. 8 months since the last one, according to the logs. Too soon, if the quiet murmurs I overheard were any indication. People spoke in lowered voices, heads inclined toward one another, the word early cropping up more than once before being swallowed by silence. When I asked, directly, if there was any plan to organize a search, the response was immediate and unanimous in its refusal. The forest was dangerous right now, they said. Better to wait. Better to let things settle. That was when the fear became visible, slipping through the town's careful composure like a crack in ice. This wasn't the steady, resigned dread I'd sensed before, the kind that comes from living with a known threat on a predictable schedule. This was something sharper, more volatile, a sense that whatever balance had been struck in the past was starting to fail. I caught people watching the tree line more often, flinching at sudden noises, children being called indoors earlier than usual. At night, lights stayed on longer, and more than once I heard doors being locked with deliberate emphasis, the sound carrying through the quiet streets. The forest seemed to respond in kind. Patrols that had once felt merely oppressive now carried an edge of active hostility, the air thickening unpredictably, sounds cutting out mid-step. I began to notice signs of movement where there shouldn't have been any, branches snapped at shoulder height, deep gouges in tree bark that didn't match any tool marks I recognized. Once, while checking a game camera I'd set well away from the mine, I found it twisted off its mount and crushed, the casing bent inward as if squeezed by something far stronger than any animal native to the area. There were no tracks leading to or from it, just disturbed earth and the lingering smell of damp stone and iron. When I brought the broken camera back to the station and logged the incident, I felt a familiar sense of professional obligation tightening in my chest. Something was wrong here, something beyond normal wildlife behavior or environmental instability, and it was my job to address it. But every instinct I had, sharpened by years in the field, told me that pursuing this too aggressively would put me at odds, not just with the forest, but with the town itself. I was an outsider, no matter how long I stayed, and outsiders who disrupted established patterns didn't last long here. That much was becoming painfully clear. The night the rain came hard enough to mask other sounds was the night I realized the warnings weren't just about safety, they were about timing. I lay awake, listening to the steady drumming on the roof, the water pooling and running in unseen channels outside, when a sound cut through it that didn't belong. A heavy impact, distant but unmistakable, followed by a scraping movement that set my teeth on edge. It came from the direction of the mine. I waited, heart pounding, for something else, a scream, a call for help, any sign that someone else had heard it too. But the rain swallowed everything. When the sound came again, closer this time, it carried a rhythm to it, a deliberate cadence that suggested intent rather than accident. In the morning, the town was silent in a way that felt new. Not the usual early quiet, but something more brittle, as if everyone were holding their breath. I learned what had happened, not from an announcement, but from the way people avoided meeting my eyes. From the way Ruth's hands shook as she poured coffee without spilling a drop. Another person was gone. A man who'd lived on the northern edge of town, close enough to the forest that his porch light barely touched the trees. This one had no photograph on the board yet, no paper trail to soften the reality. His family sat together in their living room, surrounded by neighbors offering food and presents, their grief raw and visible, but tempered by something that looked uncomfortably like acceptance. That was when someone finally spoke to me plainly. Though even then the truth came wrapped in warning rather than explanation. An older man caught me outside the station as I was heading out for patrol. His voice low and urgent as he told me I needed to stop asking questions, stop walking the north trails, stop being seen near the mine. He didn't tell me what lived there or why it took people, only that it always had, and that the town had learned, at great cost, how to live around it. It came when it came, usually once a year, sometimes less, and when it did, the only thing that kept it from taking more was restraint. Attention, he said, made it restless. Change made it hungry. As he walked away, leaving me standing there with the weight of his words pressing down on me, I understood for the first time why my presence here felt so significant. The creature, whatever it was, wasn't just part of the forest. It was part of the town's rhythm, a dark pulse everyone else had learned to move around. And now, with my questions and patrols and broken cameras, that rhythm was starting to stutter. The disappearances were coming closer together. The fear was spreading faster. And somewhere beneath the ground, in the dark tunnels of a mine that refused to stay dead, something was listening. Once the idea of a pattern lodged itself in my mind, it became impossible to ignore. Everything I'd seen since arriving in the town reshaped itself around that understanding, small details slotting into place with unsettling precision. The mine, the disappearances, the quiet acceptance that followed each loss. None of it was random. This wasn't a town besieged by chaos. It was a town governed by routine, even if that routine revolved around something monstrous. What frightened them now wasn't the creature itself, but the sense that the old rules were slipping, that the careful spacing between tragedies was tightening into something unpredictable and dangerous. I spent the next few days buried in records, pulling decades-old files from the station's archives, and cross-referencing them with county reports and regional databases. The mine dominated the paperwork like a recurring nightmare, its name cropping up in incident logs, environmental assessments, and safety inspections that all stopped abruptly around the same period. There had been a collapse, officially, a structural failure blamed on outdated supports and aggressive extraction methods, but the details were sparse, contradictory in places, as if the event had been documented by people who didn't quite agree on what they'd witnessed. Several miners were listed as deceased, their bodies unrecovered, but there were others who simply vanished from the records entirely, names appearing once and never again. After that, the mine was sealed, declared unsafe, and slowly erased from public discourse, even as it remained etched into every map and every conversation by omission. What stood out most was the timing. Before the collapse, accidents and fatalities clustered tightly together, a chaotic burst of loss that seemed to culminate in the decision to shut everything down. Afterward, the reports thinned dramatically. One missing person every year or so, sometimes with longer gaps in between. Always under circumstances that defied easy explanation. Hunting mishaps with no bodies. Walkers who strayed off marked trails and were never found. Locals who stepped out one night and didn't come back. The spacing was consistent enough to suggest intent, a grim equilibrium that held steady for decades, until now. The most recent disappearances disrupted that rhythm completely. 3 in less than a year, 2 within weeks of each other. When I plotted them out on a map, marking dates and locations, the cluster around the mine tightened visibly, like something drawing breath before speaking. I sat back in my chair, the dim light of the station casting long shadows across the room, and felt a cold certainty settle over me. Whatever lived down there had noticed me. Not just my presence, but my attention. And it was reacting. The town felt different after that, as if the tension I carried inside had begun to leak outward and infect everything around me. People watched me more openly now, their gazes lingering just a second too long before sliding away. Conversations stopped when I approached, resumed only after I'd passed. I could feel their fear shifting, no longer focused solely on the forest or the mine, but on me as well. To them, I wasn't a protector. I was a veritable, an unknown quantity introduced into a system that had survived by keeping things stable and unexamined. One afternoon, as I was restocking supplies at the station, I found a folded note tucked beneath the door, unmarked and unsigned. It contained only a few words, written in careful, blocky handwriting. "You're making it worse." No threat, no explanation, just a statement of fact. I stood there for a long time with the paper in my hand, listening to the distant sounds of the forest, and wondered how many people in this town believed that, as firmly as they believed in the sun rising and setting. That night, I dreamed of the mine for the first time. Not as it was now, sealed and silent, but as it must have been before the collapse. Lit by lanterns and echoing with the sounds of work. I walked its tunnels alone, boots crunching over gravel. The walls close enough to brush my shoulders, and everywhere I went I felt the sensation of being followed just out of sight. When I turned, there was nothing there, only darkness stretching deeper than it should have, swallowing the light in uneven waves. I woke with the taste of iron in my mouth and the sound of scraping still ringing in my ears. The next disappearance hit the town like a physical blow. This time it was a boy, barely 17, last seen heading home from a friend's house near the southern edge of the forest. He should never have been anywhere near the mine, but proximity didn't seem to matter anymore. The pattern had broken completely. The grief that followed was louder, less contained, and for the first time since I arrived, I heard anger mixed in with the sorrow. Not anger at the creature. Never that, but at the situation, at the uncertainty, at the fact that the unspoken agreement they'd lived under for so long no longer seemed to protect them. I attended the gathering at the boy's family home, out of a sense of obligation, standing quietly at the back while neighbors moved around me with casseroles and murmured condolences. The mother sat rigid on the sofa, eyes dry and unfocused, while the father stared at the floor as if it might offer answers. When our eyes met briefly, there was no accusation there, no plea, just exhaustion. They had grown up in this town, they knew the rules, and now the rules had failed them. Later that evening, one of the older residents approached me outside. His shoulders hunched against the cold, and asked if I was satisfied yet. The question wasn't hostile, just weary, and it cut deeper than any threat could have. He told me, quietly, that they'd tried to fight back once, years ago. After a similar cluster of deaths, fire, explosives, men going into the tunnels with guns and never coming out. It hadn't worked. It had only made the creature come more often, angrier, less discerning. Eventually, they'd learned to leave it alone, to give it what it took and mourn in silence. That was the price of living here. That was the cost of survival. I wanted to argue, to insist that letting something like that exist unchecked was unacceptable. But the words dried up before they reached my mouth. Because standing there in the cold, looking at the grief etched into every line of his face, I understood the terrible logic of what he was saying. They weren't cowards. They were caretakers of a fragile balance, one that demanded sacrifice and restraint in equal measure. And I was tearing at it, without fully understanding the consequences. The forest made its presence known more aggressively after that. Patrols became exercises in endurance, the air thickening without warning, the silence pressing in until it felt like a weight on my chest. More than once, I caught glimpses of movement at the edge of my vision, tall, pale shapes slipping between trees with impossible speed. But when I turned, there was nothing there, only the faint impression of having been studied. The smell of iron followed me back to the station more than once, clinging to my clothes and hair long after I'd left the woods. I began to hear voices at night, distant and indistinct, carried on the wind from the direction of the mine. At first, I told myself it was just my imagination, the product of stress and sleep deprivation. But then I recognized the cadence, the rough approximation of human speech. Once unmistakably, I heard my own name, spoken in a voice that was almost right and deeply wrong all at once. I didn't respond. I didn't move. I sat on the edge of my bed with my heart hammering and waited for the sound to fade, knowing with bone-deep certainty that acknowledging it would be a mistake I couldn't undo. By the end of the week, the town was on edge in a way that felt unsustainable. People whispered openly now, fear cracking through the veneer of acceptance they'd worn for so long. Children were kept indoors, patrols doubled, doors reinforced. And through it all, the mine remained silent. Its dark mouth hidden behind trees and warning signs that suddenly felt laughably inadequate. Whatever lived beneath it was no longer content to wait. It was reacting, escalating, testing boundaries that had held firm for generations. Standing on the station porch one evening, watching the last light drain out of the forest, I felt the full weight of what I'd done settle over me. I had come here to protect the land and the people who lived on it. Instead, I'd become the catalyst for something far worse. The creature had noticed the disruption, and it was responding in the only way it knew how, by taking more, by coming sooner, by reminding the town of the cost of change. The question that haunted me as night fell wasn't whether the town could survive this. It was whether I could live with myself if I let it continue. The mine had a way of pulling at my attention, even when I tried not to think about it. I would be halfway through routine paperwork, or a patrol log, and find my thoughts drifting north, to the dark slope beyond the tree line, where the land dipped unnaturally, as if the forest itself leaned away from something it didn't want to acknowledge. It wasn't curiosity anymore. It was pressure. A sense that something unresolved sat beneath the town like a held breath, waiting for the moment it could finally be released. I understood now why the locals avoided speaking about it directly. Naming something gives it edges. Edges invite confrontation. And confrontation, here, had consequences. I decided to learn what I could in daylight, when fear was easier to manage and the forest felt less actively hostile. The records I'd reviewed gave me just enough justification to frame the approach as a safety assessment, something I could plausibly explain if anyone questioned it. Still, as I prepared my gear that morning, there was a distinct sense that I was crossing a line, not marked by signage or fences, but by an unspoken agreement I'd already violated simply by being here. The town was quiet as I drove north, the road narrowing and roughening until it became little more than packed dirt and gravel. Trees crowded close on either side, their trunks dark and straight, branches knitting together overhead to block out the sky. The ground changed as I approached the mine, the soil turning soft and uneven underfoot, as if it had never fully settled after being disturbed decades ago. Vegetation grew in strange, stunted patterns, moss thick and spongy, ferns curling inward like closed fists. The air was colder here, carrying that familiar metallic temps that clung to the back of my throat. Even in full daylight, the place felt dim, shadows pooling unnaturally around the base of trees and along shallow depressions in the earth. The boards sealing the main shaft were weathered but intact, reinforced with steel braces that bore the marks of repeated stress, subtle bends, and hairline fractures, suggesting pressure from the other side. Someone had painted warning symbols years ago, now faded and flaking, their message long since absorbed into the collective consciousness of the town. I didn't touch the boards. I didn't need to. The evidence of activity lay all around them. Scratches scored the wood at irregular heights, not the shallow gouges of animals, but deep, deliberate marks that sank into the grain. Near the base of the entrance, the soil was disturbed, compacted and smoothed, as if something heavy had passed over it repeatedly. There were no clear footprints, no distinct tracks to follow, but the absence itself felt telling, like a conscious erasure. Whatever moved here did so in a way that left as little behind as possible, a lesson learned through long familiarity with this place. I circled the perimeter slowly, noting smaller ventilation shafts half hidden by brush, their grates rusted and bent. One of them emitted a faint draft, air flowing outward with a low, almost imperceptible sigh. When I knelt to examine it more closely, the smell intensified, carrying with it something else beneath the iron and damp stone, a stale animal musk that made my stomach tighten. I backed away instinctively, heart pounding harder than the situation warranted, and forced myself to breathe steadily until the urge to retreat subsided. This wasn't the time to panic. Panic was loud. Panic drew attention. Back at the station, I pulled more files, this time going further back than I had before, into microfilm and archived correspondence that hadn't been digitized. The deeper I dug, the clearer the picture became. The mine collapse had not been a single event, but a series of escalating incidents, unexplained equipment failures, workers refusing to enter certain tunnels, reports of noises that didn't match any known geological activity. Complaints had been dismissed, then buried, until the night a section of the mine gave way, and everything came rushing to the surface at once. Officially, it was an accident. Unofficially, the letters and handwritten notes told a different story, one of fear, confusion, and something moving through the tunnels that didn't belong there. One account, written by a foreman who'd survived the collapse, described hearing voices echoing through the shafts long after his crew had been accounted for. Another mentioned shadows moving against the lantern light, tall and misshapen, vanishing when approached. These reports stopped abruptly after the mine was sealed, replaced by terse memos about land reclamation and public safety. The silence that followed felt intentional, a coordinated effort to contain not just a hazard, but an idea. As the afternoon wore on, a pattern emerged that chilled me more than any of the individual details. The creature, for lack of a better word, didn't simply exist alongside the mine. It was shaped by it, adapted to it. The tunnels provided cover, access, and a way to move unseen beneath the forest and the town itself. Over time, it had learned the rhythms of human activity, the seasons, the points of vulnerability. It had learned restraint. The annual disappearances weren't random acts of predation. They were calculated, minimal, just enough to maintain whatever equilibrium had been struck after the collapse. Until now. I returned to the mine later that day, drawn back by a need to reconcile the paper record with the physical reality. The forest seemed to close in around me as I approached. The air growing thick and heavy, sound dampening until my own footsteps felt intrusive. I stayed well back from the main shaft, focusing instead on one of the smaller auxiliary tunnels partially obscured by undergrowth. The grate there had been forced open recently, bent outward as if pried from within. A dark void yawned beyond it, swallowing the light from my torch almost immediately. I didn't enter. I stood there, heart hammering, and listened. At first, there was nothing. Then, faintly, I heard movement, a slow dragging sound that stopped when I shifted my weight. I froze, every muscle locked in place, and waited. Seconds stretched into minutes, the silence so complete, it felt artificial. When the sound came again, it was closer, accompanied by a soft, wet exhalation that raised the hairs on my arms. Something down there was aware of me. Not in the abstract sense of sensing disturbance, but in the deliberate way of a predator gauging distance and reaction. I backed away carefully, never turning my back on the opening, and didn't relax until I was well clear of the mine's influence. The forest released its hold on me gradually, sound returning in uneven bursts. Birdsong, the rustle of leaves, the distant creak of trees swaying in the wind. I realized then that the oppressive silence wasn't a constant feature of the woods. It was localized, controlled. The creature shaped its environment as effectively as it shaped its behavior. That night, the voices returned. Louder this time, clearer. I heard my name again, spoken from different directions, the cadence shifting subtly with each repetition. One voice was almost conversational, as if testing the sound, while another stretched the syllables unnaturally, drawing them out until they lost their meaning. I didn't answer. I sat in the dark and listened, the cold certainty settling in that this wasn't mimicry in the way animals mimic sounds. This was learning. The creature was experimenting, refining its understanding of how humans communicated, how they reacted. The town felt the shift too, though few were willing to acknowledge it openly. People avoided the north end entirely now, detouring long distances rather than pass anywhere near the mine. Children whispered about noises under their beds, about shadows moving where they shouldn't. One morning, I found deep impressions in the mud behind the station, too elongated to be human, too narrow to be any animal I recognized. They led toward the forest and vanished abruptly, as if the thing that made them had simply ceased to exist beyond that point. An older woman finally broke the silence when I encountered her near the general store, her voice trembling despite her attempt at composure. She told me the creature had never come this often before. Not in her lifetime, not in her parents' lifetimes. It was supposed to be once a year, sometimes less. That was the agreement, spoken or not. The fact that it was taking more now meant something was wrong. Something had changed. And whether I intended it or not, she believed that something was me. I didn't argue. I couldn't, because standing there, listening to the fear crack through her words, I knew she was right. My presence, my attention, my refusal to accept the old balance. Without question, all of it had disrupted a system that survived by staying invisible. The creature was responding the only way it knew how, pushing back against the disturbance, reasserting control through escalation. As I lay awake that night, the sounds from the mine echoing faintly through the forest, I realized the most terrifying truth of all. The creature wasn't just reacting blindly to change. It was adapting to it, learning from it. And if that was the case, then the town's worst fear wasn't unfounded. Because a creature that could learn restraint could also learn aggression. And I had given it every reason to try. The first time the creature entered the town proper, it did so quietly enough that most people never realized what had changed. There was no scream, no frantic pounding on doors, no obvious sign of violence to announce its presence. Instead, there was a subtle wrongness that settled over the place like a low fog, a sense that the boundary everyone relied on, the unspoken line between forest and settlement, had been crossed without permission. I felt it the moment I stepped outside that morning, the air heavy and stale despite the cold, carrying that unmistakable scent of iron and damp stone, far from where it belonged. The tracks were what confirmed it. They ran through the soft earth behind the diner. Deep impressions that elongated unnaturally toward the toes, the heel marks narrow and uneven, as if the weight above them had shifted mid-step. They weren't animal tracks, not in any configuration I recognized, and they weren't fully human either. The stride was wrong, too long in some places, too short in others, as if the thing that made them didn't quite understand how walking was supposed to work above ground. They led from the forest edge, crossed the open ground behind the buildings, and disappeared again between two houses near the north end of town, leaving behind only disturbed soil and the lingering sense of something having passed too close. I followed them as far as I dared, my pulse loud in my ears, acutely aware of how exposed I was in the open. Curtains twitched as I passed, faces half seen and quickly withdrawn. People knew what the tracks meant, even if they refused to say it aloud. The creature had never done this before. It had always taken from the edges, from places where the forest could swallow evidence and grief alike. Coming into town was a violation of the old rules, a deliberate message that containment was no longer guaranteed. The missing person was discovered an hour later. A man in his 50s, known for rising early and tending his small garden before breakfast, was simply gone. His back door stood open, the latch broken outward, wood splintered, as if something had pushed through with casual force. Inside, nothing appeared disturbed at first glance, the table set for one, a mug cooling beside the sink, until you looked closer and noticed the subtle signs of struggle that had been carefully minimized. a chair knocked just slightly out of place. Fingernail gouges in the doorframe at shoulder height. No blood, no drag marks. It was as if whatever had taken him had lifted him cleanly from the space and carried him away. The town's reaction was immediate and visceral. This wasn't something they could rationalize or dismiss as an unfortunate but contained incident. The creature had stepped into their shared space, their supposed refuge, and taken someone in full view of the rules they'd lived by for generations. Fear rippled outward, replacing the brittle acceptance I'd grown accustomed to with something far more volatile. People gathered in small clusters, voices raised and overlapping, anger bleeding through the panic. Doors were reinforced, windows boarded, old weapons brought out of storage and cleaned, despite the fact that no one truly believed they would help. I was pulled aside by more than one resident that day, their words sharp and accusatory, despite the fear behind them. They told me this had never happened before, not like this, and demanded to know what I'd done to provoke it. I had no good answer to give them. I could tell them about the broken camera, the forced ventilation shaft, the voices calling my name at night, but none of that would undo the reality staring us in the face. The creature had adapted to my presence, learned the limits of the town's tolerance, and decided those limits no longer applied. As the day wore on, reports came in of other disturbances. A child claimed something had stood outside his bedroom window before dawn. Its silhouette tall and thin against the glass, head tilted as if listening. A woman found deep scratches carved into the side of her house. The wood scored with marks too wide to be human fingers, but placed at a height that suggested upright movement. Each account added another layer to the mounting sense of dread, until the town felt like a coiled spring ready to snap. That evening, I walked the streets as dusk settled in, trying to project calm I didn't feel. The forest loomed closer than ever, the tree line pressing in at the edges of the streetlight's reach. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, pooling in corners and alleys, and more than once I caught myself glancing over my shoulder, convinced I'd heard something moving just out of sight. The air was thick with the smell of rain and iron, and beneath it all, that same animal musk I'd come to associate with the mine clung stubbornly to everything. The encounter itself happened so quickly that I almost missed the significance of it. I was rounding the corner near the general store when I heard a sound that didn't belong, a low rhythmic scraping that echoed faintly off the buildings. I froze, heart hammering, and strained to locate its source. The sound came again, closer this time, accompanied by a soft, labored breath. Slowly, carefully, I turned toward the alley between the store and the adjacent house, torch raised but unlit. It stood there, partially obscured by shadow, its pale form blending unnervingly well with the gray of the buildings. It was taller than I'd expected, its proportions elongated and wrong. Shoulders hunched forward, as if the weight of its own body pulled it down. Its skin was mottled and gray, streaked with dark mineral stains that looked almost embedded. And its limbs ended in hands that were too long, fingers splayed awkwardly, as if still learning how to grip. When it lifted its head, I saw its eyes catch the light, reflecting it back with an animal sheen that made my breath hitch. For a moment that stretched unbearably long, we simply stared at one another. I could see the faint movement of its chest as it breathed, hear the wet rasp of air passing through its throat. It smelled overwhelmingly of the mine stone, rust, rot, a scent that spoke of confinement and darkness. Then, in a voice that was unmistakably human and deeply wrong, it spoke my name. The sound of it shattered whatever fragile composure I'd managed to maintain. Hearing my name spoken like that, the cadence almost right, but stripped of warmth or recognition, sent a jolt of terror through me that no amount of training could fully suppress. I took a step back, hand instinctively moving toward my radio, and in that moment the creature shifted, its body blurring with sudden, impossible speed. 1 second it stood in the alley, the next it was gone, retreating toward the forest with a fluidity that defied its awkward build. The town erupted after that. Someone had seen it too, a glimpse at the edge of vision, a pale shape slipping between buildings. The last vestiges of denial collapsed under the weight of shared experience. This wasn't something lurking unseen anymore. It was present, it was active, and it was no longer content to hide beneath the ground. That night, the town gathered in a way it hadn't before, fear overriding long-held restraint. Voices rose in heated arguments, demands made and rejected, old wounds torn open in the open air. Some called for immediate action, for fire and explosives, for sealing the mine once and for all. Others pleaded for calm, reminding everyone of what had happened the last time they'd tried to fight back, of how much worse it had become. The divide cut deep, splitting families and friendships along fault lines, shaped by generations of quiet terror. I stood among them, listening, and felt the weight of responsibility press down on me harder than ever. This was no longer a matter of observation or containment. The creature had forced the issue, stepping into the light and daring us to respond. And in doing so, it had made one thing painfully clear. The mine no longer held it. As the crowd slowly dispersed, leaving behind only the echo of raised voices and the crackle of cooling anger, I realized that the choice I'd been trying to avoid was closing in around me. Either the town would cling to its old rules and hope the creature retreated back into the dark, or someone would have to act decisively, knowing full well that the consequences might be worse than the threat itself. Standing alone in the street, the forest watching from every direction, I knew that whatever came next would change this place forever. The story came out the way rot comes out of old wood, slowly at first and then all at once, forced into the open by pressure that had been building for years. No one stood up in the square and announced it. There was no official telling, no single voice that claimed ownership of the truth. Instead, it emerged in fragments over the course of a long, tense evening, shared in half-finished sentences and careful glances, passed from one person to another like something fragile that might break if handled too roughly. By the time I understood what they were really telling me, the air felt heavier than it ever had, thick with the weight of memory and regret. It started with an old photograph that someone brought out from a drawer, the edges brittle and the image faded to a dull brown. It showed the mine as it had been before the collapse, its entrance wide and open. Men standing in front of it with lanterns raised and faces set in expressions that hovered between pride and exhaustion. I recognized a few of the names written on the back from the records I'd read. Men who officially died in accidents or went missing under circumstances never fully explained. The person holding the photograph told me quietly that those men hadn't been killed by falling rock or bad air. They'd been lost during the first attempt to stop what had come out of the mine, back when the town still believed it could fight rather than endure. According to the fragments pieced together from multiple accounts, the creature had not appeared suddenly. It had crept into awareness slowly. Its presence felt long before it was seen. Miners reported hearing footsteps behind them in empty tunnels, breathing where no one stood, voices echoing from shafts that should have been sealed. Tools went missing, then reappeared in places no human could have reached. Animals refused to enter certain areas, balking at tunnel mouths with a panic that seasoned handlers couldn't explain. At first, management dismissed it as nerves, the product of long hours underground and too little light. Then the disappearances began, isolated at first, easy to rationalize as accidents or desertions, until the night the foreman and 3 others followed something deeper into the mine and never came back. Panic took hold then, sharp and immediate. This was before the town learned to be quiet about its fear, before restraint became instinct. Men armed themselves and went into the tunnels in groups, determined to confront whatever was down there. They came back shaken and bloodied, some of them babbling about something tall and pale that moved through the rock like smoke, others refusing to speak at all. One man returned without his partner and spent the rest of his life drinking himself into silence. The mine was shut down officially soon after. The collapse, blamed on structural failure, but the truth lingered beneath the surface like a buried ember. When the disappearances didn't stop, when people continued to vanish from the edges of town, the fear hardened into resolve. That was when they decided to use fire. It sounded reasonable at the time, almost hopeful. Fire was cleansing, final, something humans understood and controlled. They poured fuel into the tunnels, stacked old timber supports and debris near the main shafts, and waited for night, when they believed the creature would be deepest underground. Families gathered at a distance, watching the men work with a grim, collective determination that bordered on desperation. This wasn't revenge, it was survival. The explosion was larger than anyone expected. When the fire caught, it raced through the mine faster than the men could retreat, igniting pockets of gas and dust that had built up over decades of extraction. The ground shook violently, a deep, rolling concussion that knocked people to their knees and sent birds screaming from the trees. Flames tore out of the mine entrance, roaring into the night sky, followed by a plume of black smoke that carried the stench of burning oil and something far worse. For a brief, terrible moment, the town believed it had worked. Then the screaming started. It didn't come from the people gathered outside. It came from beneath their feet, echoing up through the earth itself, a sound so raw and inhuman that it froze everyone in place. Survivors described it later as a mixture of agony and rage. A voice that shifted and warped as it carried through collapsing tunnels and shifting rock. The mine continued to burn for hours, the entrance partially caving in under the heat, sealing off whole sections of the underground network. When the fire finally died down and the smoke cleared, the town stood in stunned silence, waiting for something, anything, to emerge. Nothing did, not that night, not the next. Weeks passed without another disappearance, and the hope that had flared briefly settled into something like relief. People began to believe the creature had been destroyed, burned alive deep underground, its remains entombed beneath rock and ash. They sealed the shafts more thoroughly, reinforced the collapse points, and told themselves the nightmare was over. It took 6 months for them to realize how wrong they'd been. The first person taken after the fire was a child, pulled from her bed in the middle of the night, without a sound. Her room showed no signs of forced entry, the window intact, the door still locked from the inside. The only evidence left behind was a faint smell of smoke and iron that lingered in the air long after the search parties returned, empty-handed. After that, the disappearances accelerated, coming closer together than ever before, sometimes only weeks apart. The creature didn't confine itself to the edges anymore. It took from the heart of the town, as if punishing them for their attempt to destroy it. Worse still, it had changed. Those who glimpsed it in the aftermath of the fire described something angrier, more erratic, its movements faster and less restrained. The careful spacing that had once governed its behavior vanished entirely, replaced by a chaotic pattern that left the town reeling. The screams people heard at night carried echoes of the fire. The creature's voice layered with sounds it shouldn't have known, crackling flames, collapsing wood, human cries twisted and repeated until they lost their original shape. It was as if the fire hadn't killed it, but taught it something new. Eventually, through sheer attrition and fear, the town learned a brutal lesson. Fire didn't cleanse the mine. It enraged what lived there. The creature responded to ignition not by retreating, but by asserting itself more aggressively, punishing disruption with escalation. When the disappearances finally slowed again, when the spacing between them stretched back toward something resembling the old cycle, it was only after the town had collectively agreed to stop interfering. They reinforced the seals, yes, but they never tried to burn it again. They learned to leave the darkness alone, to accept the occasional loss as the price of stability. As the story unfolded around me, told in overlapping voices and weighted silences, I began to understand why the mere suggestion of fire now terrified them more than the creature itself. Darkness was predictable. Darkness could be lived with, mapped, endured. Fire changed things. Fire provoked. Fire taught the thing beneath the mine how to hate. The knowledge settled heavily in my chest, reshaping everything I'd thought about what needed to be done. I had imagined fire as a solution, a final act of destruction that might end the cycle once and for all. Now I saw it for what it truly was in this place, a catalyst. A way to shatter whatever fragile restraint the creature still possessed. The town's fear of ignition wasn't superstition. It was memory, sharpened by loss and tempered by decades of survival. Later that night, as the crowd dispersed and the stories tapered off into uneasy silence, I walked to the edge of town alone, the forest pressing close on all sides. The smell of iron hung thick in the air, stronger than usual, and beneath it I caught the faintest trace of smoke, as if the ground itself remembered the fire, even after all these years. Somewhere far off, from the direction of the mine, I heard movement, a slow, deliberate shifting that sent a chill through me, despite everything I'd learned. The creature had not only survived the fire, it had adapted to it. And now, with the cycle broken and the town on the brink of open defiance once more, the lesson of that night loomed larger than ever. If fire was used again, there would be no returning to the old balance. There would only be escalation. And standing there in the dark, listening to the forest breathe around me, I realized with sickening clarity that the choice I faced was narrowing rapidly. The town was afraid of fire because they knew exactly what it awakened. but fear alone would not hold back a creature that had already begun to step into the light. Sooner or later, someone would strike a match. The town did not fracture all at once. It cracked slowly, almost politely, the way ice gives way under steady pressure rather than a sudden blow. From the outside, it might have looked as though nothing had changed. People still went to work. The diner still opened in the mornings. Smoke still rose from chimneys at dusk, but beneath that thin layer of routine, something had shifted irreversibly. The shared understanding that had held the place together for generations was eroding, replaced by suspicion and resentment that seeped into every interaction. Fear no longer pointed outward, toward the forest or the mine. It turned inward, searching for someone to blame. I felt it most acutely in the way people spoke to me now, their words edged with something sharp and unspoken. Conversations that once ended in uneasy silence now ended in abrupt departures. Chairs scraping loudly against floors as people stood and walked away rather than continue. Eyes followed me through the streets openly, no longer bothering to look away when I noticed. Children were pulled closer when I passed, as if proximity itself carried risk. To them, I was no longer just an outsider. I was the disruption made flesh. The arguments started quietly, behind closed doors and drawn curtains, but they didn't stay there for long. One evening, voices rose outside the diner, anger cutting through the usual hush like a blade. I arrived to find a small crowd gathered, faces flushed and tense, words tumbling over one another in overlapping accusations. Some demanded action, insisting that doing nothing had clearly failed, that the creature's intrusion into town proved restraint was no longer an option. Others shouted them down, reminding everyone of the fire, of what had happened the last time fear had driven them to act. The old balance, fragile as it was, had kept most of them alive. Breaking it again could doom them all. I stood at the edge of the crowd, listening, the weight of their words pressing down on me. Every argument circled back to the same unspoken truth. The creature's increased activity coincided too neatly with my arrival to be ignored. Someone finally said it outright, voice shaking with anger and grief, as they pointed at me and demanded to know why I was still here. The question hung in the air, heavy and accusatory, and I realized with a jolt that I didn't have a convincing answer. Leaving might restore the old rhythm. Staying might destroy it completely. The disappearances continued. Not as rapidly as the town feared, but not slowly enough to allow any sense of relief to settle in. Each loss deepened the divide, turning neighbors against one another as grief sought an outlet. Families who had once stood together in shared mourning now eyed each other with thinly veiled resentment, tallying losses as if numbers might justify their fear. The creature no longer needed to step into town to spread terror. The town was doing that work for it now. At night, the forest seemed to watch the unfolding chaos with quiet patience. The sounds from the mine grew more frequent, the scraping and shifting no longer confined to deep underground. Sometimes I heard it near the tree line, movement just beyond the reach of the lights, deliberate and unhurried. It was as if the creature were testing boundaries, gauging how far it could go without provoking another attempt at destruction. And beneath that measured restraint, I sensed something else, a curiosity sharpened by conflict, an awareness that fear was turning the town inward and making it vulnerable in ways it hadn't been before. I began to receive warnings of a different kind then. Not notes or whispered advice, but direct hostility. Someone slashed the tires of my truck one night, the cuts clean and precise. Another time, I found the station door jammed from the outside, forcing me to climb out a window to get free. No one claimed responsibility. No one needed to. The message was clear enough. I was no longer welcome, and my continued presence was seen as a threat. Still, there were a few who sought me out quietly, away from the others. They spoke in low voices, glancing over their shoulders as if afraid of being overheard by more than just human ears. They told me they were tired of waiting, tired of sacrificing one person at a time, in the hope that restraint would be rewarded. They asked me what I planned to do, whether I had a solution that didn't involve fire or abandonment. Their desperation weighed on me, pulling me in opposing directions at once. Leaving would be the safer choice, for me and perhaps for them. Staying meant accepting responsibility for whatever came next. The breaking point came sooner than I expected. A woman was taken in broad daylight, pulled from the edge of town while walking home from the store. There were witnesses this time, fleeting glimpses of a pale shape moving with terrifying speed, a scream cut short as if smothered. The creature did not retreat immediately. It lingered at the forest edge, tall and still, its silhouette visible to anyone brave or foolish enough to look. The message was unmistakable. It was no longer hiding. It was asserting dominance. Panic swept through the town in a wave too powerful to contain. People barricaded themselves indoors. Armed patrols formed spontaneously, and old plans were dragged out and argued over with renewed urgency. Fire was mentioned openly now, no longer a taboo, but a desperate possibility. Those who had once argued against it found themselves drowned out by grief and rage, their warnings lost in the noise. I watched it all unfold with a growing sense of inevitability, knowing that the town stood on the brink of repeating a mistake it barely survived the first time. That night, as tensions simmered and fear pressed in from all sides, I walked alone to the edge of the forest, stopping well short of the mine, but close enough to feel its presence humming beneath the ground. The air was thick with iron and damp earth, the silence punctuated by distant movement I could not see. I spoke aloud then, not expecting an answer, telling the darkness that this couldn't continue, that something had to change. The words felt thin and useless even as I said them. When the response came, it wasn't in words. It was in a sudden shift of pressure, a tightening of the air that made breathing difficult, followed by the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps moving just out of sight. I caught a glimpse of pale movement between the trees, tall and narrow, watching. It did not approach. It did not retreat. It simply observed, as if waiting to see what choice I would make. Returning to town, I found it divided more sharply than ever. Some people avoided me entirely now, refusing to meet my gaze. Others looked at me with open hostility, their fear transmuted into anger. A few, however, watched me with something like expectation, as if they sensed that the decision they were too afraid to make might soon be forced upon me instead. The weight of that unspoken demand settled heavily on my shoulders. I understood then that neutrality was no longer an option. The creature's escalation had stripped the town of its fragile consensus, and fear had begun to turn them against one another. If nothing changed, the violence would come from within as surely as it would from the forest. The old balance was gone, and whatever replaced it would be shaped by the choices made in the coming days. Standing alone in the station that night, listening to distant sounds echo through the trees, I felt the last of my hesitation crumble. Leaving might save me, but it would condemn the town to tear itself apart while waiting for the next inevitable taking. Staying meant stepping fully into the role I'd resisted from the moment I arrived. Not as an observer or a guardian of rules, but as an agent of change, no matter the cost. Outside, the forest shifted softly, the mine's presence pressing up through the ground like a pulse. Somewhere in the darkness, the creature waited, patient and alert. As the town it had haunted for generations finally began to break under the weight of its own fear. And I knew that whatever came next would not be contained by silence alone. The first time it spoke to me deliberately, I knew the difference immediately. This wasn't the distant mimicry I'd heard before. The half-formed echoes of human voices drifting from the forest, or rising from the depths of the mine like bad memories, refusing to stay buried. This was focused, directed, intentional. It came on a night so still the town felt suspended in amber. Every sound sharpened by the absence of wind, the darkness pressed close enough that even the streetlights seemed to struggle against it. I was alone in the station, reviewing patrol notes that no longer felt meaningful, when I heard the knock. It wasn't loud. It wasn't urgent. Just 3 slow impacts against the wood, spaced evenly enough that they couldn't be mistaken for coincidence. My first thought was that someone from town needed help, that fear had finally pushed them past their reluctance to come to me. I remember standing there for a moment, listening, heart pounding, and telling myself that whatever had happened, it was still my job to respond. When I opened the door, the porch was empty. The light above the entrance cast a pale circle onto the ground, illuminating drifting mist and the edges of the steps, but nothing else. No footprints, no movement. The forest loomed just beyond the reach of the light, dense and impenetrable, and for a brief, foolish moment I felt relief. Then the voice came again, closer this time, from just beyond the porch railing. It said my name, the way someone who knew me well would say it, familiar and almost gentle, and the sound of it froze me in place. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The voice waited, patient, as if expecting a response, and when none came, it tried again, altering its tone slightly, smoothing the edges, refining the shape of the sound. I realized then that it wasn't simply repeating what it had heard before. It was adjusting, learning from silence as much as from speech. When it spoke again, it wasn't my name this time, but a question, simple and devastating in its directness. Why are you still here? The words weren't perfect. There was a slight distortion to them, vowels stretched just a fraction too long, consonants clipping sharply at the end, but the meaning was unmistakable. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the cold. This wasn't an animal calling out in confusion. This was something that understood intent well enough to challenge it. I closed the door slowly and locked it, every instinct screaming at me not to invite further interaction. The voice didn't react immediately. Instead, I heard movement around the building, slow and deliberate, footsteps that circled the station without urgency. It was mapping the space, familiarizing itself with the structure the same way it had learned the mine, the forest, the town. When it spoke again, the sound came from the back of the building, closer to the wall of my bedroom. You changed it, it said, and this time there was something almost accusatory in the cadence. Sleep was impossible after that. The voice didn't persist endlessly, but it returned often enough to keep me on edge, testing different phrases, different inflections, sometimes calling my name, sometimes repeating fragments of conversations I'd had with townspeople over the past weeks. It knew far more than it should have, and with each repetition, the mimicry grew more precise. By dawn, my nerves were frayed to the point where the sound of my own footsteps felt intrusive. The town noticed the shift almost immediately. People reported hearing voices outside their homes at night. Voices that sounded like loved ones asking to be let in, or strangers calling for help from the forest edge. Most resisted the urge to respond, their fear overriding compassion, but the psychological toll was immense. The creature wasn't just taking people anymore. It was probing, exploiting human instinct, turning empathy itself into a weapon. The anger that followed was fierce and unfocused, lashing out at anyone who seemed connected to the change. I became that focal point by default. When I walked through town, conversations fell silent abruptly, eyes tracking my movements with a mixture of fear and expectation. Someone finally confronted me outright, demanding to know whether I'd spoken to it, whether I'd made some kind of agreement without telling anyone. The accusation stunned me, not because it was true, but because it revealed how deeply the town's trust had eroded. In their fear, they were beginning to see me not just as a catalyst, but as a potential collaborator. The creature didn't appear again in daylight, but its presence was felt everywhere. The forest seemed closer, darker, its edges pressing into the town's streets like a tide creeping up the shore. Animals vanished entirely, birds falling silent, dogs refusing to go outside after dusk. Even the mine seemed to hum with activity. A low vibration that could be felt through the soles of my boots when I stood too near the north end of town. The confrontation came 2 nights later, on a patrol I hadn't planned to take. I found myself drawn toward the forest, without quite understanding why, following a pull that felt both external and deeply personal. The moon hung low and swollen behind a veil of clouds, casting the world in a sickly gray light that distorted familiar shapes. I stopped at the tree line, heart pounding, and waited. It emerged without ceremony, stepping out from between the trees as if it had always been there. Up close, the wrongness of its form was impossible to ignore. Its limbs were elongated and uneven, joints bending at slightly incorrect angles. Skin stretched taut over a frame that looked both emaciated and powerful. Mineral stains streaked its body, dark lines etched into pale flesh like veins of ore, and when it breathed, I could hear a faint rasp as though its lungs were never meant for open air. It didn't rush me. It didn't threaten. It simply stood there, head tilted slightly, eyes reflecting the moonlight with an animal gleam that was unsettlingly focused. When it spoke, the sound was stronger now, the distortion less pronounced. "You don't belong here," it said, and the statement carried weight far beyond its simplicity. This wasn't a warning, it was an observation. I forced myself to speak, my voice sounding thin in the open air. I told it the town couldn't live like this anymore, that the taking had to stop. The creature listened, unmoving, and for a moment I thought I sensed something like amusement ripple through its posture. When it replied, the words were slow and deliberate. "It lived," it said, gesturing vaguely toward the town. "You changed the count." Understanding hit me like a physical blow. The creature didn't see its actions as predation or cruelty. It saw them as maintenance, a system that had functioned, imperfectly but consistently, until my arrival disrupted the variables. Its increased activity wasn't driven by hunger or anger alone, but by a perceived need to correct an imbalance. In its own twisted logic, it was responding appropriately to change. The conversation ended abruptly when it stepped back into the forest, retreating with that same fluid, unnatural speed I'd seen before. I stood there long after it vanished, the implications of what it had said echoing in my mind. Killing it wasn't just about stopping the disappearances anymore. It was about ending a system that had embedded itself into the town's survival, however monstrous that system was. When I returned to the station, the decision felt inevitable. The creature could speak now. It could reason, adapt, manipulate. Leaving it alive meant allowing it to continue refining its methods, pushing further into the town, eroding what little remained of the old boundaries. Restraint would no longer hold it back. Silence would no longer contain it. The town sensed the shift in me before I spoke a word. People watched as I moved through the streets with a new purpose, their fear mingled now with a fragile, desperate hope. No one asked what I planned to do. No one offered to help. They had seen what happened to those who interfered in the past, and they were unwilling to court that fate again. If I chose to act, I would do so alone. That night, as I sat in the dim light of the station, listening to the forest breathe around me, I accepted what had been circling my thoughts since the creature first spoke my name. There was no version of this where everyone walked away unscathed. The town's fear of fire, of disruption, of breaking the cycle, was justified. But the cycle was already broken. The creature had seen to that. And if it could learn to speak, to reason, to challenge my presence, then it could learn far worse. Killing it was no longer an abstract possibility. It was the only remaining option. Once the decision settled into me, it did not feel heroic or righteous. It felt mechanical, like a door clicking shut behind me with no handle on the other side. The idea of killing the creature didn't arrive with anger or resolve, but with a cold, narrowing clarity that stripped everything else away. There were no more questions worth asking, no alternative paths left unexplored. The town had exhausted its capacity for waiting. The creature had outgrown its restraint, and I had crossed too many lines to pretend neutrality was still an option. I stopped trying to convince anyone after that. The few who noticed the change in my behavior didn't comment on it, and those who might have questioned me avoided me entirely. I moved through the town like a ghost, present but disconnected, my focus drawn inward as I began to plan. If the creature had survived fire before, if it had adapted to violence and disruption, then brute force alone would not be enough. Whatever ended this would need to be final, irreversible, and shaped around the one thing it could not abandon, the mine itself. The mine was not just its home. It was its nervous system. I returned to the archives one last time, this time not searching for explanations but for vulnerabilities. Old engineering schematics showed the network of tunnels spreading beneath the forest like a web. Shafts intersecting and overlapping in ways that no longer made practical sense. Some sections had been sealed after the fire, others partially collapsed, creating pockets of unstable ground and air. What struck me most was how interconnected everything still was. Despite decades of neglect and intentional sealing, the mine remained structurally cohesive enough to transmit pressure, sound, and heat across long distances underground. It was not dead, it was dormant. That was where the idea took shape. I began mapping the surrounding terrain in earnest, marking load-bearing points, natural fault lines, areas where the rock composition shifted from solid bedrock to looser sediment. The forest above mirrored these weaknesses in subtle ways. Trees growing at odd angles, shallow sinkholes, masked by moss, patches of ground that felt hollow underfoot. The creature knew these paths instinctively. It moved through them as easily as blood through veins. If I could collapse the right sections at the right time, I might not need to chase it at all. The problem, of course, was fire. Fire had failed before. Worse than failed, it had taught the creature how to rage. The town's fear of ignition was well-founded, etched into their collective memory by loss and consequence. But fire alone hadn't been the problem. Fire without containment had been. The mine had burned, but it hadn't been sealed. Heat had moved freely. Tunnels had vented pressure outward, instead of trapping it. The creature had survived by retreating deeper, letting the chaos burn itself out. What I needed was not destruction, but suffocation. I began collecting supplies quietly, taking advantage of the town's distracted fear and my official access. Fuel, yes, but not in the quantities used before. Structural charges salvaged from old demolition kits, enough to destabilize key junctions without triggering a chain reaction too early. Metal plating and fasteners scavenged from abandoned equipment sheds. Everything had to be staged, placed carefully, the timing precise. One mistake could collapse the wrong section, alert the creature too soon, or worse, leave an escape route open. The isolation set in quickly. Working alone in the forest for hours at a time, I felt the town recede behind me, its problems replaced by the immediate, tangible dangers of the terrain. The forest watched me constantly now. I felt it in the way branches creaked under no wind, in the sudden silences that fell when I paused too long in one place. Once, while placing a charge near an old ventilation shaft, I became acutely aware of breathing that wasn't my own, slow and controlled, rising from the darkness below. I froze, sweat chilling on my skin, and waited. The breathing continued for several seconds, then faded, retreating deeper into the earth, as if satisfied. It knew what I was doing. That knowledge followed me back to the station every night, a pressure behind my eyes that sleep couldn't fully dispel. The creature didn't try to speak to me again, but its presence lingered everywhere, heavy and deliberate. I found fresh markings near my work sites, scratches carved into stone, deep impressions pressed into damp earth, signs that it was tracking my movements with growing interest. It wasn't trying to stop me, not yet. It was watching, learning, perhaps even allowing me to proceed. The town noticed my absence from daily life more than my preparation. People stopped expecting me at gatherings, stopped looking to me for reassurance or answers. In their minds, I had already crossed over into something other than human concern. A few nights before everything would change, Ruth left a thermos on the station porch without a word, her eyes avoiding mine as she turned away. It was the closest thing to support I received, and it carried the quiet weight of farewell. As the final pieces fell into place, the fear shifted. It became sharper, more focused, stripped of abstraction. I wasn't afraid of the creature anymore. I was afraid of the timing, of misjudging its movements, of triggering the collapse too early or too late. The mind had taught the town restraint through punishment. Now I was about to punish it in return, using the same intimate knowledge of space and pressure it had cultivated over decades. The night I finished placing the last charge, the forest felt wrong in a way I hadn't experienced before. Not hostile, anticipatory. The air vibrated faintly, a low hum that resonated in my chest, as if the ground itself were holding its breath. I stood at the edge of the clearing, sweat-soaked and exhausted, and realized with sudden clarity that there would be no retreat after this. Once the first collapse was triggered, the chain of events would unfold whether I was ready or not. I returned to town before dawn, moving quickly through empty streets that felt like a place already abandoned. Lights burned in a few windows, silhouettes shifting behind curtains, people awake and listening, even if they didn't know what for. I paused once, glancing back toward the forest, half expecting to see the creature standing at the edge of town again, watching openly as it had before. The tree line remained still, but I could feel its attention on me, heavy and unblinking. Back in the station, I sat alone in the dim light and went over the sequence one last time. Entry points, trigger order, collapse, timing. The final ignition would not be a wildfire racing through tunnels. It would be a controlled burn, starved of oxygen, designed to consume what remained without venting outward. If it worked, the mine would become a tomb, not just for the creature, but for the system that had allowed it to exist. If it failed, the consequences would ripple far beyond the town. As the sky began to lighten, I felt an unexpected calm settle over me. The noise in my head quieted, replaced by a singular focus that felt almost merciful. Whatever happened next, the waiting would end. The town would no longer live under the constant threat of disappearance. The creature would no longer dictate the rhythm of their lives. And if the cost of that freedom was my own survival, then it was a price I had already accepted. Outside, the forest shifted, branches swaying without wind. Somewhere beneath the ground, stone creaked and settled, responding to pressures it had not felt in decades. I knew, with a certainty that bordered on instinct, that the creature was moving now, tracing the same pathways I had studied, sensing the disturbance in its domain. It was coming closer to the surface, perhaps drawn by the same inevitability that had driven me to this point. I gathered my gear and stepped out into the cold morning air, the first light of day touching the treetops with a pale, indifferent glow. The mine waited beyond them, silent and patient, its dark mouth hidden but unmistakably present. This was no longer preparation. This was the beginning of the end. And somewhere in the depths below, something ancient and adaptable was waking fully, ready to meet the threat it had allowed to grow. Crossing the tree line felt like stepping through a membrane. The forest swallowed sound almost immediately. The open air behind me replaced by a dense, muffled quiet that pressed in from all sides. Even my breathing seemed too loud, each inhale scraping through my chest, as if the air itself resisted being taken in. The path I followed wasn't a trail so much as a memory of one, ground worn thin by decades of reluctant use, and beneath that, by something far older moving with purpose beneath the soil. I kept my pace steady, forcing myself not to rush. Speed made mistakes. Mistakes here would not forgive. The auxiliary shaft I'd chosen lay half hidden behind a tangle of undergrowth, its bent grate gaping outward like a broken jaw. Cold air flowed from it in a steady exhale, carrying the smell of damp stone and iron so strong it coated my tongue. I paused there longer than necessary, listening. The mine was awake now. I could feel it in the subtle vibration under my boots, the low, almost subsonic hum that resonated through bone rather than ear. This wasn't the silence of abandonment. It was the quiet of something waiting. Inside, the light died fast. My torch cut a narrow tunnel through the dark, its beams swallowed by walls that seemed to lean inward the deeper I went. The temperature dropped sharply, cold seeping through my clothes and settling into my joints. Water dripped somewhere out of sight, the sound magnified and distorted by the cramped space, each drop landing like a countdown. I moved carefully, memorizing each turn, each marker I'd placed days earlier, trusting muscle memory where sight failed. The mine's outer tunnels were rough and uneven, their walls scarred by tool marks and older gouges that no human hand could have made. The first sound of pursuit came sooner than I expected. A faint scraping echoed down the tunnel behind me, slow and deliberate, stopping whenever I stopped. It was testing me, gauging distance, confirming what it already suspected. I didn't look back. Looking back was a luxury I couldn't afford. Instead, I focused on the rhythm of my steps, the placement of my feet, the next junction ahead, where the tunnel widened briefly before narrowing again. The charges there were already set, dormant and patient, waiting for the signal that would turn preparation into commitment. The creature moved differently underground. Above ground, its speed had been startling, almost fluid. Here, it was constrained by space, forced to navigate angles and obstacles that didn't quite accommodate its elongated frame. The sounds it made reflected that frustration, the scrape of bone against stone, the wet rasp of breath forced through passages too small for comfort. It was close now, close enough that I could feel the disturbance in the air when it shifted its weight, the pressure change rippling through the tunnel like a held breath released. When it spoke, the sound crawled along the walls before reaching me, distorted and multiplied by the confined space. It didn't use my name this time. It didn't need to. "You came back," it said, and there was something like satisfaction threaded through the words. I kept moving, jaw clenched, refusing to answer. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to put as much distance between us as possible, but running would only shorten the gap faster. Down here, speed belonged to whoever knew the tunnels best, and for all my planning, this was still its domain. The first collapse triggered exactly as planned. I crossed the marked point and thumbed the remote without breaking stride, feeling rather than hearing the muffled detonation behind me. The ground shuddered, dust billowing through the air in choking waves as rock and timber gave way, sealing off the tunnel I'd just left. The sound of the creature's movement changed immediately, the scraping replaced by a sudden, furious thrashing that sent vibrations through the walls. It roared then, the sound tearing itself apart as it echoed through collapsing passages, a raw expression of rage and pain that made my vision blur. I didn't slow. The collapse wasn't meant to trap it outright. It was meant to funnel it, to force it deeper along the routes I'd prepared, narrowing its options while preserving mine. The air grew thicker with dust, each breath a struggle as grit coated my lungs. My torch beam flickered, then steadied, illuminating a junction I'd studied countless times on paper, but never fully appreciated until now. The walls here bore scorch marks from the old fire, blackened stone etched with patterns that looked disturbingly deliberate, as if something had clawed at the rock itself while it burned. The creature's voice followed me through the maze, fragments of speech breaking apart and reforming as it adapted to the acoustics. It repeated words I'd spoken days earlier, warnings and reassurances twisted into mockery. "You said stop," it rasped, somewhere behind and to the side now, moving through a parallel tunnel I hadn't accounted for. Panic flared briefly, sharp and disorienting, before training kicked in and pushed it back down. Parallel routes were expected. That was why the sequence mattered. I triggered the second set of charges as I entered the old extraction chamber, a vast hollow space that swallowed sound and light alike. The explosion boomed hollowly, collapsing the parallel tunnel in a cascade of stone that sent a shockwave through the chamber floor. The creature screamed again, closer this time, and the sound carried something new. Desperation layered beneath the fury. It was being herded now, forced along paths it didn't prefer, its learned mastery of the mine challenged by a sudden violent reconfiguration of its world. The chamber itself was a cathedral of absence, its ceiling lost in shadow, walls slick with moisture and streaked with mineral deposits that glimmered faintly in the torchlight. Old machinery lay scattered and half-buried, twisted metal forms that cast grotesque shadows across the uneven ground. I moved through it quickly, skirting the edges where I'd placed the next sequence, every sense stretched to its limit. The air here was colder, denser, carrying the weight of decades of abandonment and something far older beneath that. It emerged into the chamber with terrifying speed, dropping from an upper ledge with a force that cracked stone and sent debris skittering across the floor. Up close, the scale of it was overwhelming. Its limbs unfolded awkwardly as it landed, joints snapping into place with sickening pops, eyes reflecting the torchlight with an intelligence that made my stomach churn. It didn't rush me immediately. It straightened slowly, towering over the ruined machinery, and spoke again, voice steadier now, despite the damage. "You are wrong," it said. It lived. I raised the remote, thumb hovering over the trigger, and met its gaze. For a moment, the chamber held us both in a suspended tableau. Dust drifting slowly through the air, the mine groaning softly around us, as if aware of the confrontation unfolding within its depths. I told it the count was over, that whatever balance it believed in had ended the moment it stepped into the town. The words sounded inadequate even as I spoke them, human attempts to impose morality on something that had never shared our definitions. The creature tilted its head, a gesture disturbingly reminiscent of curiosity, and took a step closer. "You broke it," it said, and the accusation landed with unexpected weight. Before I could respond, it lunged. The world narrowed to motion and instinct. I dove aside as it crashed through the space I'd occupied, claws tearing through stone and metal with equal ease. The impact sent shockwaves through the chamber, dust and debris raining down as old supports groaned ominously. I scrambled to my feet, heart hammering, and sprinted toward the final corridor, the one that led to the deepest section of the mine. The creature followed, its movements less fluid now, constrained by the damage and the narrowing space, but still terrifyingly fast. I triggered the third collapse as I ran, the explosion tearing through the chamber behind me and sealing it off in a thunderous roar. The floor buckled, walls cracking and shifting, as the mine protested the sudden violence inflicted upon it. The creature's roar cut off abruptly, replaced by the sound of stone grinding against stone as the chamber partially caved in. For a brief, fragile moment, I thought it might be over. Then the ground beneath me shook violently, a surge of force rippling through the corridor as something slammed into the collapse from the other side. The walls bowed inward, cracks spiderwebbing across the rock, and the creature's voice echoed through them, distorted but unmistakably close. It was still coming, injured, furious, relentless. The final corridor descended sharply, air growing stale and thin with every step. My lungs burned, vision narrowing at the edges as oxygen dwindled. This was the point of no return, the place I'd marked as the end of my escape route. Beyond it lay the central shaft, the heart of the mine, where the last sequence waited, the controlled burn that would consume what remained and starve it of air. There would be no running after this. No retreat. Either it ended here, or neither of us would leave. Behind me, the sounds of pursuit grew louder, closer, the creature forcing its way through rubble with brutal determination. The mine groaned around us, the structure strained beyond what it had endured, even during the fire decades earlier. As I reached the final junction, breath coming in ragged gasps, I understood with stark clarity that escape was no longer possible for one of us, and I had already chosen who that would be. The central shaft did not announce itself with grandeur. There was no sudden widening, no dramatic threshold that marked the transition from outer tunnels into the mine's core. Instead, the corridor simply narrowed, the ceiling lowering until I had to hunch forward, breath scraping painfully through my chest as the air grew stale and thin. The walls here were smoother, older, carved not just by tools but by time and pressure, the stone worn into subtle curves that caught the torchlight in dull, oily reflections. This was the oldest part of the mine, the place everything else radiated from, and standing there, I felt as if I had stepped into the ribcage of something enormous and long buried. The sound of pursuit followed me relentlessly, closer now, the creature's movements no longer masked by distance or rubble. Each step it took sent vibrations through the rock that I felt in my teeth, in my bones, as if the mine itself were responding to its presence. It had shed any pretense of restraint. The careful, testing pursuit from earlier was gone, replaced by raw, determined aggression. Whatever balance it believed in no longer mattered. It knew this was the end of the line. I reached the edge of the shaft and stopped, forcing myself to slow my breathing despite the panic clawing at my throat. The space opened downward into darkness, so complete, the torchlight seemed to bend away from it, swallowed after only a few meters. Old ladders clung to the walls at irregular intervals, their rungs twisted and rusted, remnants of a time when men had willingly descended into this place believing it could be mastered. The smell here was overpowering: iron, damp stone, and beneath it all, that familiar animal musk, intensified to the point of nausea. This was where it nested, where it returned between cycles, where it believed itself untouchable. The ignition points were already in place, hidden along the shaft walls and in the surrounding support cavities, wired together in a sequence that would collapse inward rather than outward, sealing every known route of escape. I checked them one final time, hands shaking despite my efforts to steady them, confirming connections by touch rather than sight. The plan was brutal in its simplicity. Collapse first, contain second, burn last. No roaring inferno, no explosive release of pressure, just fire starved of oxygen, consuming everything trapped inside until nothing remained that could move or think or adapt. The creature entered the chamber behind me with a sound like tearing stone. It emerged from the tunnel in a rush of dust and debris, its form hunched and damaged now, mineral-streaked skin split in places to reveal darker tissue beneath. One arm hung at an unnatural angle, bone grinding audibly as it moved, but its eyes burned with undiminished focus. It stopped several meters away, chest heaving, breath rasping loudly in the confined space. For the first time since I had seen it, it looked less like a master of this place and more like something wounded and cornered. It spoke then, and the sound carried differently here, the shaft amplifying and distorting the words until they seemed to come from the rock itself. "You learned," it said, voice uneven but unmistakably intentional. There was no mockery in it now, no curiosity, just recognition. I didn't answer right away. I watched the way it shifted its weight, testing the ground, mapping distances and angles even as it spoke. Adaptation was instinct for it. It could not stop assessing, calculating, searching for advantage. I told it this ended here, that the town would no longer count, its dead in quiet intervals, no longer live by a rhythm dictated by something hiding underground. The words felt heavy and inadequate in my mouth, human attempts to impose finality on a creature that had outlived generations. When it replied, there was a faint, chilling trace of something like confusion threaded through the anger. It lived because it learned. It said, "You unlearn." The accusation struck deeper than I expected. In its own warped way, it saw itself not as a predator, but as a survivor. Something shaped by catastrophe and forced into a role it had refined over time. The mine collapse, the fire, the ceiling. Each attempt to destroy it had only sharpened its understanding of the world above. It had learned restraint because restraint kept it alive. It had learned language because language gave it power. And now, faced with a threat it could not retreat from, it struggled to reconcile that learning with the reality of a trap that did not offer adaptation as an option. It lunged. The distance closed in a heartbeat, its damaged limbs swinging wide as it barreled toward me with terrifying momentum. I barely had time to dive aside, the rush of displaced air slamming into me as it passed, claws gouging deep into the stone where I had stood. Pain flared in my shoulder as I hit the ground hard, breath driven from my lungs in a wheezing gasp. The torch skittered away, light spinning wildly across the shaft walls before coming to rest at an angle that cast long, monstrous shadows. The creature turned with a speed that belied its injuries, roaring as it came at me again. I scrambled backward, boots slipping on damp stone, and triggered the first collapse. The explosion was muffled but powerful, the ground lurching violently as sections of the shaft above us gave way. Rock and timber rained down, the air filling instantly with choking dust. The creature recoiled, caught partially in the collapse, its roar cutting off into a strangled bellow as debris slammed into its frame. I forced myself upright, lungs burning, and ran for the control point embedded in the wall, fingers slick with sweat and blood as I primed the next sequence. The mine screamed around us, the structure protesting violently as pressure redistributed through its ancient veins. Cracks spiderwebbed across the walls, widening with each distant detonation. Somewhere deep below, something collapsed with a thunderous finality that reverberated through the shaft like a death knell. The creature dragged itself free of the rubble, with brutal determination, movements jerky and uneven now, but no less dangerous. It staggered toward me, eyes fixed, jaw opening and closing, as if trying to shape words that no longer came easily. When it spoke again, the sound was raw and fragmented. "You will seal," it rasped. "Then you will starve." There was no threat in the statement. Just fact, delivered with the cold certainty of something that understood confinement all too well. I reached the final control panel, and hesitated for the briefest moment. The weight of what I was about to do, pressing down on me with crushing force. This was it. Once the ignition sequence began, there would be no stopping it. No chance to retreat or reconsider. The mine would collapse inward, the fire consuming oxygen, until the shaft became a vacuum of heat and smoke and suffocation. Whatever lived here would die here. The creature seemed to sense the shift. It slowed, its approach cautious now, wounded intelligence flickering behind its eyes. It took a step back, then another, retreating toward the darkness of the shaft, as if considering escape even as the walls groaned and closed in. For the first time, I saw something like fear ripple through its posture, not panic. Fear born of recognition. The trap was complete. I triggered the ignition. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Heat surged through the shaft, a deep pulsing roar as fire bloomed in the sealed cavities, starved and furious. The air rushed violently toward the core, a sudden gale that nearly tore me from my feet as oxygen was consumed at an impossible rate. Smoke billowed upward, thick and acrid, turning the light into a dim, hellish glow that cast everything in shades of red and black. The creature screamed then, the sound tearing itself apart as it echoed through collapsing stone and burning air. It staggered, clawing at the walls, trying to climb away from the inferno surging below, but the shaft betrayed it. Ladders twisted and snapped, rungs tearing free under its weight, as supports failed in a cascading collapse. The fire did not rush outward. It pulled inward, consuming, compressing, devouring the space the creature occupied. I stumbled back, shielding my face as heat washed over me in punishing waves. My lungs screamed for air that was rapidly vanishing, each breath shallower and more painful than the last. The mine groaned and shifted, the structure folding in on itself, exactly as planned, sealing every route, every vent, every possible escape. The creature's screams faded into a raw, choking rasp, then into nothing at all as the fire consumed what little oxygen remained. The final collapse came with a sound like the world breaking. The shaft shuddered violently, walls slamming together as the core gave way, sealing itself beneath tons of rock and ash. The force knocked me flat, vision blurring as I hit the ground hard, the world reduced to heat, noise, and suffocating darkness. I lay there, barely conscious, lungs burning, waiting for the mine to finish what it had started. When the noise finally subsided, the silence that followed was absolute. Not the watchful quiet of the forest or the oppressive hush of the tunnels, but a dead, final stillness that pressed in on all sides. The air was thin and foul, but breathable enough to keep me alive. I lay there for a long time, unmoving, listening for any sign of movement beneath the rubble. There was nothing. The mine's heart, which had pulsed with malevolent life for generations, had finally stopped beating. As consciousness ebbed and flowed, one thought repeated itself with relentless clarity. Whatever else this place had been, whatever price the town had paid to survive, the cycle was over. The ground had been turned against the thing that claimed it, and for the first time in decades, perhaps centuries, nothing waited beneath the forest but stone and silence. I don't remember deciding to move. I only remember the sensation of breath returning in shallow, painful pulls, each one scraping raw tissue inside my chest, as if my lungs were being asked to relearn a function they'd nearly forgotten. The darkness around me was complete at first, heat lingering like a living thing pressed against my skin, but slowly, sensation began to sort itself into edges and shapes. The stone beneath me was warm and gritty, vibrating faintly as the mind continued to settle, the aftershocks of collapse rippling outward in diminishing waves. There was no sound of pursuit, no echo of movement beneath the rubble. Only the low, exhausted groan of a structure finally giving up the struggle to hold together. When I managed to push myself upright, the effort sent a spike of pain through my ribs sharp enough to steal what little air I'd regained. I waited it out, forehead pressed to the stone, counting the seconds between tremors. The torch lay several meters away, its beam dulled by dust and smoke, but still burning. I crawled toward it slowly, fingers numb and clumsy, dragging my body through debris that shifted and slid with ominous ease. Every movement felt like a gamble, the risk of triggering another collapse hanging over me like a sentence waiting to be read aloud. The shaft behind me was gone. Where the heart of the mine had opened into darkness, now lay a mass of crushed rock and twisted supports fused together by heat and pressure. Smoke seeped from the cracks in thin, reluctant streams, carrying with it the acrid stink of burned metal and something else I couldn't quite place, a smell that felt final in a way no fire ever had before. I stood there longer than necessary, staring at the rubble, listening for anything, a scrape, a breath, a whisper, and hearing nothing at all. The silence was wrong. It wasn't the tense quiet I'd grown accustomed to, the kind that felt watchful and coiled, waiting for the right moment to break. This was empty, hollow. The mine no longer felt like a presence pressing up from beneath the forest. It felt like a wound that had finally been closed, the pressure released so abruptly the surrounding tissue didn't yet know how to respond. I realized then that part of me had been braced for the creature to survive in some altered form, to whisper from the stone or claw its way free in one last act of defiance. The absence of that possibility was disorienting in a way I hadn't anticipated. Getting out was harder than getting in. The carefully mapped routes I'd memorized no longer existed as they once had. Collapses sealing off passages and forcing me to navigate unfamiliar detours through half-destroyed tunnels. The air grew marginally fresher the further I moved from the core, but each breath still burned, dust coating my throat and lungs. More than once, I had to stop and rest against the wall, head spinning as dizziness threatened to pull me under. Time lost its shape down there, minutes stretching into something indistinct as I focused solely on putting one foot in front of the other. The mind fought me all the way out, settling and shifting with every step, as if resentful of my attempt to leave. Rocks skittered loose from above without warning, clattering loudly before vanishing into darkness. Water poured suddenly from fractured seams, turning the floor slick and treacherous. At one point, I had to crawl through a section where the ceiling had dropped, so low I could barely draw breath without scraping my back against stone. Each obstacle felt less like coincidence and more like the last convulsions of a dying body, muscle memory persisting, even after the heart had stopped. When I finally reached the auxiliary shaft, daylight filtering down in pale, uncertain rays, the relief was so sharp it nearly overwhelmed me. I hauled myself out onto the forest floor and lay there for a long time, face pressed into damp earth, lungs heaving as I gulped air that tasted impossibly clean by comparison. Above me, the trees stood motionless, their leaves barely stirring despite the devastation beneath them. The forest did not celebrate. It did not mourn. It simply endured. The walk back to town passed in a kind of fugue. My body moved on instinct, mind dulled by exhaustion and pain. The weight of what I'd done pressing down on me with increasing insistence as adrenaline ebbed away. The forest felt different now, quieter but not relieved, as if it were holding back a question it didn't yet know how to ask. No voices called from the trees. No movement followed me just out of sight. The path felt empty in a way that bordered on unnatural. The town met me at its edge, though not with cheers or accusations. People stood in small clusters, watching in silence as I emerged from the tree line, soot-streaked and unsteady on my feet. Someone stepped forward to help me when my knees buckled, hands firm but hesitant, as if unsure whether touching me was permitted. No one asked what had happened. They already knew, or at least sensed enough of the truth to understand that asking would not bring comfort. The first night after the collapse was the hardest. The town did not sleep. Lights burned in every window, people sitting together in uneasy groups, listening for sounds that never came. The absence of the familiar nocturnal disturbances was more unnerving than their presence had ever been. Doors remained locked, weapons kept close at hand, habits ingrained by generations of fear, refusing to release their hold simply because the source of that fear was gone. I lay on a cot in the station, wrapped in blankets that smelled faintly of dust and disinfectant, and listened to the silence press in from all sides. Every creak of the building made my heart stutter, every distant noise sparking a surge of adrenaline that left me shaking when nothing followed. Sleep came in fragments, broken by dreams of collapsing stone and choking smoke, of eyes glowing in the dark just beyond reach. When I woke, gasping and disoriented, the silence was still there, vast and indifferent. Morning brought no immediate answers. The mine remained sealed, the ground around it unstable but quiet. Smoke dissipating into the cold air in thin wisps that dwindled as the hours passed. People gathered at a distance, staring at the sight with expressions that ranged from awe to dread, as if expecting the earth to split open again at any moment. No one approached too closely. No one suggested digging. Some things, once buried, were better left that way. The disappearances stopped. That fact settled over the town slowly, not with relief, but with a cautious, almost suspicious disbelief. Days passed without incident. Nights followed, quiet and unbroken. Children slept through until morning. Animals returned tentatively to the outskirts, birdsong creeping back into the soundscape in hesitant bursts. Each normality felt provisional, as if it might be snatched away the moment anyone grew comfortable enough to trust it. Grief, long delayed, surged in the creature's absence. Without the constant pressure of fear to hold it in check, the losses of decades came rushing to the surface. Families who had accepted disappearances as an inevitability now confronted the reality of what had been taken from them. Not as a natural order, but as a crime finally exposed. The town held vigils, not just for the most recent victims, but for all of them. Names spoken aloud for the first time in years, photographs brought out and shared in trembling hands. The weight of collective mourning was immense, and it settled heavily over everything. Some people avoided me entirely during that time, unable or unwilling to reconcile gratitude with the violence of what I'd done. Others sought me out in quiet moments, offering thanks in voices thick with emotion, as if afraid speaking too loudly might disturb whatever fragile peace had settled in. A few asked questions I couldn't fully answer, whether it was truly gone, whether it could ever come back, whether what I'd done might have consequences still waiting to unfold. I told them the truth, as best I understood it. The mine was sealed. The core collapsed. Whatever had lived there no longer had space, or air, or time to adapt. That knowledge did not bring the relief they'd hoped for. The town had been shaped by the creature's presence for generations, its rhythms and rules woven into daily life so deeply they'd become instinct. Without that looming threat, people struggled to understand who they were supposed to be now. Old boundaries felt meaningless. Long-held superstitions clung stubbornly to consciousness, habits refusing to die simply because their original purpose had vanished. The silence was not empty to them. It was accusatory, a reminder of everything they'd endured and everything they'd accepted as unavoidable. As for me, I felt unmoored. The purpose that had driven me forward with such ruthless clarity dissolved in the aftermath, leaving behind exhaustion and a gnawing uncertainty. I replayed the final moments in the mine endlessly, wondering whether there had been another way. Whether ending the cycle had required such total destruction. The creature's words echoed in my mind, stripped of context, but heavy with implication. It lived because it learned. In killing it, I had ended a system that had persisted through adaptation and restraint, replacing it with something untested and fragile. The forest seemed to watch the town differently now, not with hostility, but with a distant, inscrutable patience. Paths once avoided opened up tentatively, footsteps pressing new patterns into the soil. The mine's absence was felt beneath the trees like a missing note in a long-held chord, the land adjusting slowly to a pressure it no longer needed to accommodate. Whether that adjustment would be gentle or catastrophic remained an open question. One evening, standing at the edge of town as the sun dipped behind the tree line, I felt the full weight of what had been lost and what had been gained settle over me at once. The silence pressed close, vast and unyielding, offering no guidance on how to live within it. The town was free of the thing that had haunted it for so long, but freedom, I realized, was not the same as peace. It was simply the absence of a known enemy. And in that absence, new fears began to take shape. The weeks that followed did not bring clarity. They brought adjustment, which was far more difficult. Without the creature, without the mine exerting its constant, subterranean pressure, the town found itself adrift, in a way none of them had prepared for. Survival had been reactive for so long that no one remembered how to live without anticipating loss. The silence, once feared, became an uncomfortable companion, its presence forcing people to confront thoughts they'd spent generations suppressing. Life resumed in small, tentative gestures. Shops opened earlier. Children played closer to the tree line than they ever had before, parents watching with a mixture of pride and unease. Paths that had been abandoned for decades were walked again, footprints pressing into soil that still felt faintly hollow in places, as if the earth hadn't fully accepted the absence beneath it. Each reclaimed habit felt like an act of defiance, but also like a test, as though the town were daring the silence to break. I stayed longer than I intended. Leaving immediately felt wrong, like walking away from a structure still settling after an earthquake. I watched as people renegotiated their relationships with the land, with one another, with the idea of safety itself. Some clung to the old rules out of habit, refusing to go near the forest after dark, locking doors that no longer needed locking. Others rejected those instincts entirely, pushing boundaries with an almost reckless enthusiasm, determined to prove that fear had no hold over them anymore. Grief continued to surface in unpredictable waves. With the immediate threat gone, people began to talk openly about the disappeared, comparing memories, filling in gaps that had been left deliberately vague for years. Stories emerged that reframed familiar faces in unsettling ways. A man who had once volunteered to patrol the forest alone, perhaps knowing more than he'd admitted. A woman who'd insisted her husband would never have gone near the mine, even as evidence suggested otherwise. The past shifted under scrutiny, no longer protected by the convenient excuse of inevitability. Some turned their anger inward. They questioned why they had accepted the cycle for so long, why they had allowed the mind to dictate their lives through omission rather than force. Others turned that anger outward, directing it at me in ways that were quiet but unmistakable. They asked whether I'd had the right to decide for them, whether ending the creature had been an act of salvation or simply another form of imposition. I listened to every accusation, every expression of doubt, because I didn't have an answer that could settle the matter cleanly. I had made a choice when no one else could or would, and that choice would echo through this place long after I was gone. The mine itself became a focal point of collective unease. Though the collapses had sealed it thoroughly, people avoided the area as if it still breathed beneath the rubble. The ground continued to settle sporadically, deep muffled sounds rippling through the earth without warning. Engineers brought in from outside confirmed that such shifts were normal after a collapse of that magnitude, but their reassurances did little to calm nerves. Normality, after all, was a concept the town no longer trusted. I visited the site alone one afternoon, standing at the edge of the exclusion zone where warning tape fluttered weakly in the breeze. The forest around it felt different, not hostile or watchful, but strangely indifferent, as though whatever awareness had once threaded through the roots and stone had dissipated. I crouched and pressed my palm to the ground, half expecting to feel that familiar vibration beneath my skin. There was nothing, just cool earth and the distant, ordinary sounds of wind moving through leaves. That absence unsettled me more than any lingering threat could have. At night I still woke abruptly, heart racing, convinced I'd heard movement where there was none. The mind no longer whispered, but my mind filled the silence with echoes of what had been. The creature's voice returned in dreams, stripped of menace and reduced to statements that lingered without context. It lived because it learned. The words gnawed at me, not because I doubted the necessity of what I'd done, but because they hinted at a broader truth I couldn't ignore. Adaptation was not unique to monsters. The town had adapted to, shaping itself around horror until it became mundane. Now, stripped of that defining pressure, the town struggled to recognize itself. Change came unevenly. Some families left, unable to reconcile their grief with a place that suddenly felt too open, too exposed. Others arrived, drawn by the promise of opportunity, and unaware of the weight buried beneath their feet. New businesses opened. Renovations began. Laughter returned to public spaces, tentative at first, then more assured as weeks passed, without incident. The town began to imagine a future, not defined by avoidance or sacrifice, and that imagining was both hopeful and terrifying. I noticed subtle shifts in the forest as well. Wildlife returned in greater numbers, deer grazing closer to town, birds nesting in places they'd long abandoned. The land seemed to be reclaiming space that had been ceded under duress, its rhythms reasserting themselves without the subterranean disruption that had shaped them for so long. Yet there were moments, fleeting and difficult to articulate, when something felt off, as if the forest were listening in a different way now, attuned not to a presence below, but to the absence itself. One evening, as I walked a newly reopened trail at dusk, I heard a sound that stopped me cold. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't movement. It was a subtle resonance, a low, almost imperceptible hum that vibrated through the ground for a brief moment before fading away. I stood there, heart pounding, waiting for it to return. It didn't. When I checked the area later, there was nothing to mark the moment, no visible disturbance, no explanation that satisfied the unease it left behind. I didn't tell anyone about it. The town held a memorial near the end of the month, a gathering not just for those recently lost, but for all who had vanished over the years. Names were read aloud in a steady, solemn cadence, each one reclaiming a space in collective memory that had long been denied. Candles flickered in the twilight, their light reflecting off faces, etched with grief and relief in equal measure. Standing among them, I felt the weight of finality settle over me at last. Whatever questions remained, whatever doubts lingered, this chapter of the town's history had closed. Or so it seemed. As preparations for my departure began, I felt a growing reluctance to leave, not out of attachment, but out of responsibility. I had ended one cycle, but I had no guarantee that I hadn't started another. The town would have to learn how to exist without the structure imposed by fear, how to define itself by choice rather than necessity. That kind of learning was slower, more fragile, and far less dramatic than survival. It required patience, introspection, and a willingness to face discomfort without an obvious enemy to blame. The night before I planned to leave, I returned once more to the edge of the forest, stopping where the trees thinned and the town's lights cast a faint glow behind me. The air was cool and still, the silence deep but no longer oppressive. I listened for a long time, searching for any sign that the ground beneath me still held secrets it wasn't ready to relinquish. All I heard was the soft rustle of leaves and the distant call of an owl. Ordinary sounds that felt almost miraculous in their simplicity. And yet, as I turned to go, a thought settled into my mind with quiet insistence. The mine had been a vessel as much as a prison, a space that had shaped what lived within it as much as it had confined it. In destroying that space, I had not simply removed a creature. I had removed a pressure, a boundary, a constraint that had forced adaptation in a specific direction. What remained was a vacuum, and nature had never been kind to vacuums. I left the town the next morning under a sky heavy with low clouds, the forest receding behind me in slow, measured miles. In the rearview mirror, the place looked unremarkable. Just another cluster of buildings pressed up against an expanse of trees. No sign of the history buried beneath it. No indication of the choices that had been made in darkness. As the road curved away and the town disappeared from sight, I wondered not whether the creature was truly gone, but whether its absence would prove to be a more profound test than its presence had ever been. Some things, once removed, leave behind more than empty space. They leave behind questions, instincts, patterns of thought that do not vanish simply because their original cause has been eliminated. The ground remembers pressure, and memory, I had learned, does not always require a living thing to persist. I did not return to the town for years, and when I finally did, it was not out of intention so much as inevitability. Places like that do not release you cleanly. They settle into the back of your mind, resurfacing at odd moments when silence grows too complete or the ground beneath your feet feels subtly wrong. I told myself for a long time that what lingered was guilt, or memory, or the residue of fear burned too deeply into habit to fade entirely. That explanation worked, until it didn't. The road looked different when I drove it again. Wider, better maintained, the trees cut back just enough to make the approach feel less like a funnel and more like an invitation. There was a sign now, freshly painted, welcoming visitors, with a name that had once carried weight far beyond its letters. It struck me then how easily places reinvent themselves once the stories that define them fall out of common use. Without context, without memory, it was just another town pressed up against a forest, no more ominous than any other. I parked at the edge of town and walked the rest of the way, needing to feel the ground beneath my feet again. Buildings had been renovated, storefronts modernized, old facades stripped of their weathered caution and replaced with something brighter, more deliberate. People moved through the streets with an ease I didn't remember, their conversations unguarded. Laughter ringing out without the reflexive restraint that once kept voices low after dusk. Children rode bicycles well past sunset, their parents watching without the tight, coiled vigilance that had once defined every interaction with the dark. If I hadn't known better, I might have believed the place had always been this way. The forest too had changed, though in subtler ways. Trails that had once ended abruptly now looped deeper, winding confidently through terrain long avoided. Wildlife thrived openly, deer grazing at the edges of clearings without the skittishness that had once marked every movement. The air felt lighter, less burdened by the metallic temps that had clung to it for so long. Standing there, I understood why people had embraced the idea that the past was finished. Everything about the surface of the town encouraged that belief. I stayed in a small guest house near the center, run by a couple who had moved there after everything had already ended. They spoke of the town with easy affection, praising its resilience, its sense of community, its proximity to untouched wilderness. When I asked about the mine, casually, as if it were a footnote, rather than the spine of a history, they shrugged and said it had been sealed decades ago after an accident, nothing more than an old scar on the land that people rarely thought about anymore. Their ignorance wasn't willful, it was inherited. That night, sleep came easily at first, exhaustion from travel pulling me down into darkness without resistance. It didn't last. I woke some time after midnight with a familiar sense of pressure behind my eyes, the feeling that something in the air had shifted without making a sound. The room was still, the window cracked open to let in cool night air that carried only the ordinary smells of pine and damp earth. No iron, no smoke. And yet, my chest felt tight, breath shallow, as if my body recognized something my mind refused to name. I lay there listening, counting the seconds between sounds that never came. When sleep finally returned, it brought with it dreams I hadn't had in years. Not of the creature, not of the mine collapsing in fire and dust, but of tunnels stretching endlessly beneath my feet. Empty and smooth, their walls warm and faintly vibrating. In the dream, I walked them alone, my footsteps echoing softly, and everywhere I went I felt the impression of movement just ahead, something retreating without haste, confident that distance would always be preserved. The next morning, I went to the edge of town, where the exclusion zone had once stood. It was gone now, replaced by a simple fence and an informational plaque that spoke in neutral terms about geological instability and historical preservation. The ground beyond it was overgrown, grass and young trees reclaiming the space where fire and collapse had reshaped the land. There was no visible sign of the violence that had taken place beneath it. No marker of the thing that had once dictated the town's rhythm. Only the faint, uneven settling of earth, barely perceptible unless you knew to look for it. I stepped closer, ignoring the subtle tension that tightened my shoulders as I did. The ground felt solid beneath my boots, no hollowness, no vibration. I crouched and pressed my palm to the soil, half expecting to feel that old hum rise to meet me. There was nothing, just the cool resistance of packed earth and the distant, ordinary sounds of the forest moving on its own terms. Relief washed through me then, sharp and unexpected. For years, I'd carried the fear that I'd misjudged something fundamental. That the mine had taken the creature's body, but left behind some echo, some fragment capable of regrowth. Standing there in the daylight, surrounded by the quiet confidence of a place that had learned to live again, it was easy to believe that fear had finally outlived its usefulness. It was that belief that made the sound so unsettling. It came late in the afternoon, as the light slanted low and shadows lengthened across the forest floor. A low, almost imperceptible resonance passed through the ground. Not strong enough to be heard so much as felt, a a brief vibration that faded as quickly as it came. No one else reacted. Birds continued their calls, insects droned on, the town carried on without pause. I straightened slowly, heart pounding, and waited. Nothing followed. I told myself it was settling Earth, the kind of natural adjustment engineers had spoken about years ago. I repeated that explanation until it lost meaning, until the words became sounds rather than assurances. The rational part of my mind knew that land reshapes itself constantly, that pressure redistributes long after dramatic events have ended. And yet, standing there, I was acutely aware of how familiar the sensation felt. Not the vibration itself, but the timing of it, the way it seemed to respond to presence rather than process. That evening, I sought out one of the few residents who had lived there before everything changed. He was older now, his posture stooped, his voice softened by time, but his eyes sharpened noticeably when I asked whether he ever felt the ground move. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched the tree line for a long moment, as if gauging whether it was listening. When he finally spoke, he said the forest had been quieter since the mine collapsed, but not empty. That some nights, if the air was still enough, he felt the earth hum just faintly beneath his feet, like a memory stirring without quite waking. He didn't frame it as fear. He framed it as acknowledgement. People, he said, liked to believe that killing something removed its influence entirely. But influence wasn't always housed in flesh. Sometimes it lingered in the spaces that had been shaped to accommodate it, in habits learned too well to be unlearned quickly. The mine had been more than a shelter. It had been a structure around which an entire system of adaptation had formed, not just for the creature, but for the town itself. Removing the center did not guarantee the collapse of everything that had grown around it. That night, I walked the forest trails alone, stopping well short of where the mine had once been. Content to circle the periphery rather than test boundaries that no longer officially existed. The woods felt peaceful, genuinely so, and for long stretches I heard nothing but the soft percussion of my own steps and the distant rustle of leaves. But there were moments, fleeting and impossible to pin down, when the silence felt directed, as if the forest were pausing to listen rather than simply existing. I stopped once, heart hammering, convinced I'd heard my name carried faintly on the breeze. The sound did not repeat. When I listened more closely, there was only the wind moving through branches, shaping familiar noises into something my mind insisted on misinterpreting. I laughed softly at myself then, the sound too loud in the quiet, and kept walking. On my last day, as I prepared to leave, I stood at the edge of town one final time and looked back at it in the early morning light. It appeared whole, in a way it never had before, no longer bent around an absence it refused to acknowledge. People moved through it with purpose, unburdened by anticipation of loss. Whatever scars remained were internal, carried by those few who remembered what had been traded for survival. As I drove away, the road curving gently until the town disappeared from view, I felt a strange mixture of closure and unease settle over me. The creature was gone. Of that, I had no reasonable doubt. The mine was sealed beyond recovery. The cycle of disappearances had ended. By every metric that mattered, the story should have concluded there. And yet, nature, I had learned, did not erase patterns simply because the conditions that created them had changed. Pressure left impressions. Absence reshaped expectations. The town had lived for generations with a system that demanded adaptation through fear. And even in its absence, that legacy persisted in subtle ways, in how people listened to the ground, in how silence was interpreted not as emptiness, but as potential. Years later, when reports surfaced of unusual seismic readings deep beneath the forest, nothing dramatic, nothing alarming enough to prompt action, I thought of that low resonance I'd felt beneath my hand, of the way the mine's tunnels had once stretched, far beyond what maps recorded, branching and intersecting in ways that defied simple containment. Of the creature's words, stripped now of menace, but heavy with implication. It lived because it learned. Perhaps what I had killed was not a singular being, but the most visible expression of a process far older and more diffuse. Perhaps adaptation itself had been the true inhabitant of the mine, taking form when pressure and opportunity aligned, dissolving back into the environment when conditions changed. The thought did not terrify me the way it once might have. It simply reminded me of something humans often forget in their need for endings. Some things do not survive as bodies. They survive as conditions. And as long as the ground remembers pressure, as long as silence invites interpretation. The possibility remains, not of the same horror returning, but of something new, learning how to listen. The forest does not need monsters to be patient. It has time.